Hey guys, welcome to my React Native mini course. So React Native is a framework for building real native mobile applications using the React JavaScript framework. Now, I usually do what I call crash courses on this channel, which are typically around 60 to 90 minutes long, and we touch on the fundamentals of a specific technology and usually stuff you'd find in the docs. However, this video and project will be a little more in depth than that because in addition to looking at the fundamentals of React Native, we're going to build a full mobile app from scratch, and we're also going to implement a backend with Appwrite.io. And this will be a full CRUD application where you can create, read, update, and delete notes. We're going to have authentication so that users can have, their private notes that only they can manage. And this will give you a good understanding of how to build a real-world application with React Native. And I would highly recommend that you follow along with me. We're using Appwrite's free tier, so there's absolutely nothing you have to purchase or anything like that. In addition to learning React Native, we're also going to look at some programming principles like encapsulation. We're going to have separate services for the database tasks, notes, and authentication. So there's a lot to learn along the way, so let's get started. All right, guys, so I just want to spend a few minutes going over some slides just to give you some basic information about React Native. So as I mentioned, it's a framework for building real native mobile applications using React. And unlike traditional web development where React is used to create websites, web apps, React Native allows you to build fully functional mobile applications that run on both iOS and Android using a single code base. And the beauty of React Native is that it compiles to native code, meaning that your app isn't just like a web view inside of a mobile app. It actually runs using native UI components, making it fast and efficient. And this is what sets it apart from some of the other frameworks like Cordova or Ionic, which rely on a web-based rendering. Not to say that those technologies are garbage or anything like that, and you should never use them. They do have their use cases. With React Native, you can leverage React components to build your app's UI while using mobile-specific features like gestures, animations, and APIs from the device. So let's talk a little bit about how React Native works. A common misconception is that React Native is like a different version of React, but that's not the case. React Native uses the same React framework under the hood that your web apps use, whether you use Vite or Next.js, they all use the same React. The difference is with a web app, you're also using the React DOM library, which is what makes it work with the browser and makes it a web app. Okay, that's why when you build a web app, you always install React DOM along with the React library or framework. Now, React Native doesn't need React DOM because it doesn't need to render to the browser. React Native is it's a mobile alternative to React DOM, and instead of HTML-based elements, you use components like view and text, and these don't translate to HTML, they map directly to native UI components on iOS or on Android. And this means that when you use a text component, it's not rendering a paragraph tag like it would in a web app. You also get access to the native APIs like the camera, the photos, location services, push notifications, all that stuff. And the way that React Native is able to do this is with something called a bridge. So JavaScript itself can't interact with native modules, so the bridge acts as a middle layer that communicates between JavaScript and the native code. And this allows for high-performance cross-platform development while maintaining a native-like user experience, whether it's on iOS or Android. Now, when it comes to building a mobile app, there's a ton of benefits to using React Native. So it's cross-platform and has a single code base. And this is probably the single biggest benefit, and it's really what most of the other benefits come from. So when you create a native mobile app and you don't use React Native, if you want to build it with iOS or you want to build it for iOS and for Android, you normally have to build two completely separate applications with separate code bases and separate languages. You'd most likely build the iOS app using Swift and the Android app using something like Kotlin or Java. So you would have two completely different code bases. With React Native, you build it once and it compiles to both platforms. Not only that, but now you have React Native for web, which also allows you to create a web app using React Native. And that's actually included in the Expo framework, which we're going to use to build our React Native app. Now, since it's a single code base, it's more cost effective. If you were to hire a developer to create an iOS and an Android app, you'd be paying them for two separate code bases, two separate applications. In this case, it can lower the cost. Also, it's you have a reusable code base. It's a single JavaScript code base, reducing redundancy, fast development. So features like hot reloading allow developers to see changes instantly without recompiling the app. You also have strong UI capabilities. You can leverage React's declarative UI approach to build intuitive dynamic interfaces, and it's easy to maintain. Updates and maintenance are streamlined since both platforms share the same code base. So you can see that a lot of these other advantages come from that cross-platform advantage. Now, some examples of React Native apps. So you have Facebook, of course, since they're the creators of it. And these companies use React Native either fully, for their mobile apps or in some part of it. So Facebook and Instagram, you have Tesla, Bloomberg, Walmart, the SoundCloud Pulse mobile app is React Native. Build.com uses React Native. So these are just some of the companies that use React Native. Now, when it comes to getting started with a React Native project, you have a couple options. There's Expo and there's React Native CLI. So Expo is a set of tools and services built around React Native, and it's definitely the easiest way to get started, and it's what we'll be doing. It's a managed workflow. It allows you to build apps without having to deal with any native code at all. React Native CLI is kind of the traditional way of building React Native apps, and it gives you more control over the native code. However, it does come at a trade-off with complexity. So like I said, we'll be using Expo in this project. It's definitely what I would suggest. And it comes with all kinds of tools, from a dev server that allows you to view your app either in an emulator, in a browser, or using the Expo Go app on an actual device. So I just have some comparison here of the two if you want to look it over. With React Native CLI, you do need to manually set up your environment to compile native code, and this would include running Xcode on a Mac or Android Studio if you want to build for Android. For a beginner, this can be a little annoying and you can run into some hiccups. With Expo, the setup is more streamlined, and again, you can use the Expo Go app or you can use your browser. You can still use the emulators from Xcode and Android Studio. You just have to have those set up. With the native CLI, you do have full access to native modules and libraries. With Expo, it's a bit limited, but you can use something called EAS, which is Expo Application Services, and this allows you to build custom native code and extend functionality beyond that managed workflow. And this is obviously something that you would look at later down the line. So with both methods, you can build and publish to the app stores. OTA stands for over-the-air updates, which means that you can push updates to your app without having to go through the App Store review process. And Expo has built-in support for this, but React Native CLI doesn't, but has some libraries that can do this. It does require some additional setup. As far as navigation goes, just like with a React web app, you have a lot of options. React Navigation is really popular, a popular package to use with both Expo and React Native CLI, but Expo does have its own file-based router that works a lot like Next.js and Gatsby and Nuxt and a lot of the SSR frameworks. So that's what we'll be using, is the Expo router to have different screens or different pages. All right, so that's pretty much all I wanted to go over in the slides. I think that we established what React Native is and how it works and all that. So now let's jump in. We're going to use Expo to set up an application, and we're going to start building. All right, guys, so this is going to be a very project-focused course. So we're going to learn React Native as we build our Notes app. And we're going to get started using Expo, which is a tool set that makes everything easier when building React Native web apps. Everything from the dev server to using a simulator or using the Expo Go app to building and publishing on the App Store. It makes everything easier. And if you were to go to reactnative.dev and go to the guides and then environment setup and get started, you'll see that we need to run npx create expo app. So you do have to have Node.js installed on your system, so just make sure you have that. Okay, now as far as viewing the project, there's multiple ways to do that using Expo. When we run the server, you can view it in your browser because it does use React Native Web. You can use an iOS simulator, but you do have to be on a Mac and you have to have Xcode installed. You can view it in an Android simulator, but you'll have to install Android Studio. And then you can also view it right on your actual mobile device by installing the Expo Go app. So on your physical device, you would install Expo Go, and then when we run our server, there'll be a QR code you can scan, and it'll just open the app right on your phone, which is really nice. And I would definitely suggest trying it at least, because it's nice to just see what it would be like on a physical device. So it's up to you on how you want to run it. I'll be using the iOS simulator, but you can use whatever you want, your browser, Android, whatever. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the terminal. Just navigate to wherever you want to create this. And we're going to say npx create expo app, and I'm going to call it notes-app. And this will just generate all of our files. It has quite a bit of boilerplate demo stuff, but there's actually an npm script we can run to clear all that up and just start with a clean slate, which is really cool. Okay, so that's done. Now I'm going to actually open up VS Code. I'm going to open that folder in VS Code. And if you're using a different text editor, that's absolutely fine. Just go ahead and open up the folder. And let's make this a little bigger. All right, so as you can see, like I said, there's a lot of boilerplate. You have all these components. You have the app folder, which is how we do file-based routing with Expo Router. I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. But yeah, you can see that there's like this tabs, there's constants, hooks. I don't want to use any of this demo stuff. And like I said, we can clear it up. But let's just start the server just to kind of see what it looks like. So I'm going to open up my integrated terminal and let's run npm start. Okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to run the server, and it gives you a bunch of options. You can scan this with your mobile device if you have the Expo Go app, and like I said, it'll show on right on your physical device. If you have the Android or iOS simulator, you can press A or I. W will open it up in the web, and you can reload with R. So, and I'll just show you, if we open it up in the browser, it's going to look like this. Okay, so your landing page, and you have these two tabs at the bottom that you can switch. All right, so you can use the browser if you want. Like I said, I'm going to use my iOS simulator, so I'm going to hit I. You do have to be on a Mac, and you have to have Xcode installed in order to do this. If you want to use Android, then you need to just install the Android Studio IDE. But this should open it up on the iOS device. And I remember using React Native, years ago when it first came out, and it was dreadful to get everything set up. But now everything's extremely easy and fast. All right, so I'm just going to make the editor a little smaller here so we can see both. And you see it's the same thing that is shown in the browser. Now, when you build, you're going to notice that the UI will be a little different if you're on iOS or if you're on Android or if you're in the web app, because all these different devices, these different systems, they have different components. Your React Native components are compiled into whatever it is, iOS or Android, and they can look a little different. Now let's take a look at the package.json real quick, and you can see that for dependencies, there's a lot that Expo gives us. So we have the Expo router, splash screen, we have React Native Web. That's how we're able to use it in the browser, as well as React DOM. Like I said earlier, you don't need React DOM to use React Native, but if you want to view it in the browser, then you do. Now, if we look at the scripts, we have the start script, which runs Expo start. That's what we just did. And you can also do npm run Android, iOS, web, and it'll run Expo start with these flags, and it'll just open, whatever one of these up you want. Now, there's also this reset project script, and that's what I want to run to kind of clear up all this boilerplate. So let's just temporarily stop the server, and we're going to run npm run reset dash project. And it's going to ask if we want to save the current files in a folder called app example, just in case you want those. I'm going to say no, because there's no reason for that. We don't need the demo stuff. And then you can see that everything got cleared up. The components, the hooks folder, and the app folder now just has a layout and an index.tsx file. So it's much simpler. And now we can run npm start. And then I'm just going to hit R to reload my project. And now you can see it's much different. It just has this edit index tsx, and then it has this little header at the top with the page name of index. All right, so now we're just kind of starting with this clean slate. Now, as you can see, it uses TypeScript. Expo uses TypeScript by default. I don't want to throw another technology at you guys, especially those of you that don't know TypeScript or want to learn TypeScript right now. So what we can do is just rename these files from TSX to JSX just to use JavaScript. All right, so if you want to use TypeScript, of course you can, but you can just rename those and it'll still work just fine. Just reload. All right, now in this tsconfig, you can just close that up. And what I'd like to do is look at the index.jsx. So here you can see some examples of React Native components. You have text and view. So view you can kind of just think of as like a container around all your content, and text you can think of as like a paragraph or a heading. So these are React Native components, and that's what you need to use. If I were to change this to a div and try to do that, then I get a render error. Okay, so there's no using divs or H1s or anything like that, no HTML. There's just React Native components. And this is some of the common components that you'll be using. It's not all of them, but you'll notice that you'll only use like a small group of them, and you can do a ton with them. So we have the image component, which displays images either local or from the web, a scroll view, which is a scrollable list, a flat list, which only renders items visible on the screen. That's what we'll be using for our notes. Touchable opacity, that is to create a touchable component. So when you have a button on a native app and you hit it with your finger, it'll blink, the opacity will change, it gives you feedback, and that's what touchable opacity does. So a lot of times you'll surround either text or a button with touchable opacity. Then you have text input, self-explanatory, just like a form input, button, and then a switch, which is a toggle value, an on and off toggle. So those are some of the common components that you'll use. Now, the pages here are just React components. That's all this is, right? It's returning our React Native components, and the app folder is the folder that we use for file-based routing with Expo Router. And it's similar to how Next.js or Nuxt or Gatsby or any of those work, where if you want to have a notes page, you would create a notes folder in the app folder with an index.jsx, and you can also create a custom layout for that notes page. And that's what we'll be doing. Now, as far as styling goes, here you can see that it's inline. But usually what we'll do, and we can just do this right now, is we can bring in style sheet from React Native, and then down at the bottom we'll say const styles, and we'll set that to stylesheet.create, and then we can give it a selector, so container, and we'll just grab these here. So flex, justify content. So just like you have in React, you have your inline styling. It's very CSS-like. It's not exact CSS because this would be like, justify dash content, but a lot of the same properties, just camel case. And then what we can do is, instead of putting this all inline like this, is we can say style equals and then styles.container, and that will do the same thing. All right, I don't know why I closed that, but yeah, so that has the same styling, but now this is cleaned up. Okay, another thing that I like to do is rename my index pages in the app folder. I like to call them whatever it is and then the screen. So for instance, this is going to be the home screen. So I'm going to change the name of this. I also like to use arrow functions with the export at the bottom, which is it's just preference. If you want to keep it like this, you can, but I'm going to go ahead and just change this to an arrow function. So I'll say home screen equals and then an arrow, and then down at the bottom we'll export as default the home screen. All right, and that should look the exact same. But yeah, so just a React component in the app folder, which is our routing folder, and then the layout. This is the root layout, okay, which I also want to just make into an arrow function. Again, you don't have to do this, it's just my preference. So export default and then root layout. Now let's talk about this stack and what this is. So like I said, the app folder is our routing folder, and we're using navigation, and a stack you can think of as a literal stack of screens or pages, just like you would have a stack of plates. And when you add a new plate or a new screen, you place it on top of the stack. When you remove a plate or a screen or a page, you take it from the top first. And you can only see the top page at one time. So there's different methods to add and remove pages. So if you want to, redirect to another page, then you would use push, for instance. And a stack is what you want to use if you plan on having multiple pages, which we do. We have the home screen, which is just going to have like an image and a welcome and a button to go to the notes page. We'll have the notes page or the notes screen, which will list all the notes. And then we'll have the auth screen, which will have the register and the login. So we do want to use a stack. Now, if you have a small app and it's just going to be one screen, then you might want to use a slot instead. So you could change that to slot like that. And notice that it still has the home page here, but that header is gone. That header is put in there when you use a stack so that you can see what page you're on, and it'll also have like a back button if you add to the stack and you want to go back. So what we want to use is the stack since we're having multiple pages. So I'm going to put that back there. All right, now to customize this header, we can do that pretty easily. I want to make it orange and also change index to the text home. So what we can do is just go right in the stack component here, and we can add to it. So let's say screen options, and we can set that. We want to set that equals to an object. So we're going to use double curly braces here, and then we can say header style, and header style. Header style, and then I want to set that to, or I want to set the background color. And like I said, I'm going to use an orange color, so I'll do FF8C00. If I save that, you'll see it'll change to orange. And if I want to change the text color, I can do its header tint color, which I'm going to set that to white. So now the text is white. And then if we want to change the style of text, we can do header text, header title style. And I'm going to set that font, let's do font size, we'll set that to 20. And then I also want to do a font weight of bold. Now, if you want to have some styling that's going to pertain to any page that uses this layout, you can actually define that here as well. So under, let's go under the header title style, and we can say content style. And what we're going to do is just set the padding, let's say padding horizontal, which I'm going to set to 10, and then padding, let's say padding top, which I'm going to also set to 10, and then I'm going to just make sure the background color is white. Okay, so that'll apply to any page that's within the layout. Now, if you want to change the actual text in the header, which I do, what we can do is change the stack component from a self-closing to having an ending stack tag, and then inside of it we can say stack dot and then screen, uppercase S, and then we want to say the name of the page that we want to change is going to be the index, and then we can add options, and we want to set that to an object, so double curly braces, and then the title, I'm going to set that to home, and then just close this off. Okay, so if I do that, now you can see the title says home. All right, now I want to finish the welcome screen or the home screen. So we're going to just add a couple more components here. What I want to have is an image of like a post-it note, and then a title, some text, and then a button that goes to the notes page. So as far as the image goes, it's going to go in the assets folder and then images. And you can go in the link in the description to the repo, and you can grab the image from there. Or if you want to use your own image, you can do that as well. But I'm just going to just navigate to it on my machine here. So let's see, Notes app. Yeah, so it's going to be in assets, images, and then you want the postit.png. I'm just going to drag that over. Okay, so it looks like that. And let's just collapse that. All right, now in order to show an image, you want to use the image component from React Native. So let's bring in image, and then I'm going to go right above the text here, and let's say image, and this takes in a source prop. And it's not src like an HTML image tag. You spell out source. And we want to bring that image in. So let's say import, say post-it image, and that's going to be from, and we can use the @alias. That's basically just the root, and then assets/images/ and then it's postit.png. So we're bringing that image in, and then I'm going to set the source to that post-it image variable. And I also want it to have some styles, so I'm going to set the style equal to styles.image, which I'm going to come down here and we can add that. There's a couple other things I want to add to the container as well. I just want to do, let's say padding, we'll say padding 20, and background color, let's do just a very light gray, so F8 and then F9, FA. All right, and then we want our image styles, which I'm going to do a width of 100 and also a height of 100. Okay, and then let's do a margin bottom of 20 and a border radius of 10. Okay, and there we go. So now we have our image on the page. Now we're going to have some text under it, or the title under it. So let's go to this text right here and just get rid of that text, and let's put welcome. We'll say welcome to Notes app, and then I'm just going to add onto this text component here. Let's say style, set that to styles.title, and then I'm going to copy that down, and we're going to have a subtitle as well. And for the subtitle, we'll say, capture your thoughts anytime, anywhere. Okay, and then we'll just put that styling down here, and I'm just going to paste in the styling. So let me just grab that, and you can just either copy it, type it out. It's just this right here, or you can grab it from the repo. All right, so that's what it's going to look like so far. Now what I want to have is a button that brings us to the notes page. Now to do that, we're going to use the use router hook. So let's import that. We're going to say import use router from Expo router, and then we're going to use the touchable opacity component for the button. So we'll bring in here touchable opacity. And then let's go underneath the last text here, and let's say touchable opacity. All right, and then I just want to add to this a couple things. So one is going to be the style, which I'm going to set that to styles.button, and then it's going to have an on press. So when we press it, whatever we put in here will happen, which is going to be a function that then calls router.push, because we're pushing onto the stack the notes page, so /notes, which doesn't exist yet, but it will. All right, and then inside touchable opacity, we'll just use a text component, and we'll say, say get started, and just add on to this style and set that to styles dot, and we'll call this button text. And again, I'm just going to grab the styling for this. The styling is probably the only thing I'm going to copy and paste. Okay, so we just have the button, which is a blue background, and then we have the button text. Save that, and there we go. So I think that's a nice looking, clean looking landing page or home screen. Now the router, one thing I forgot, we're calling router.push. We have to initialize it just like you would the use router hook with a regular web app. So we just need to do const router and set that to use router. Oops, use router like that. Okay, and then we should be able to click on it, and it brings us to the page, which doesn't exist yet. So we just see this unmatched route. But notice up at the top we have the header with the title of not found, and we automatically have the back button to go back to the home page, which is nice. All right, so now that we've done that, we have the home screen set up. Let's go ahead and create our notes screen. Okay, now remember we're using this app folder, so I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it notes. Okay, and then in notes we're going to have an index.jsx, and let's also create an underscore layout.jsx. So this layout will only pertain to notes pages, and it still inherits the main or the root layout. Now for the layout, all we're gonna do is return a stack. So let's say import stack, and then let's do const note. So we'll say note layout. All right, and then what we want to do is just return. We just simply want to return stack like that. All right, and then we just want to export down at the bottom default the note layout. Okay, now for the index page, let's import view from React Native as well as text. And then I'm just going to use, I have the React snippets extension installed. So if I do SFC, it will just give me a, an arrow function component. And I'm going to call this note screen. All right, and then what I want to return from this is going to be view, and I'll give it style, set that to styles dot container. Okay, and then in the view we'll have text, and just for now I'm just going to say notes. Here let's add const styles, and we'll set that equal to style sheet dot create. Okay, and then we're going to have our container, and let's say flex 1, padding 20, and background color white. Okay, so now we should be able to go to the notes page. Okay, so there it is. Now notice that there's this secondary header, and you can keep that if you want. I don't want to use it though, I just want the top one. So in the notes layout, what we can do is just add on to the stack here. We can say screen options and set that to an object with header shown and set that to false. And then that will get rid of that header. Okay, now we also want to edit this because I want it to be uppercase N notes. So there's a couple ways we could do it. We could go in the page directly and surround this with stack.screen, but you can also go into the parent layout. So this would be the root layout where we have the other one, and just copy this down and then change the name from index to notes. And instead of title, since it's not the main page here, it's just it's a sub page that inherits this layout, we use header title. And then we want to change the text here to notes, uppercase N, and now you can see that that's changed. So you can keep all your, all your titles nice and neat in the root layout. All right, so now I want to start to work on displaying notes, and ultimately we're using Appwrite as our back end. We're going to fetch them from the database, but for now we'll just kind of hard code it into the component state. All right, because we can use state, use effect, all the stuff you can do with React, you can do with React Native, right? Because it essentially is React. So let's import up at the top use state from React, and then we're going to add our state here. Let's say const and then notes and set notes. And I'm assuming that you know the basics of React and state and all that. If not, then I would definitely suggest watching my React crash course first. But I would think that you guys know at least the basics. So we're going to say use state, which is going to be an array. So our notes will be an array of objects, and we're just going to hard code these for now. So we'll say ID1, and then the text, which I'll say note 1. Okay, I'm just going to copy that down a few times. This will be note 2. So note 2, and we want to change the ID to 2. This one will be 3. Change that to 3. Okay, so that's our state. Again, ultimately this is going to come from Appwrite, but I just want to get them on the page. So next thing is to display them, and I want to use a FlatList component. So I'm going to bring in FlatList from React Native, and we're going to come down here. We can get rid of that text component, and let's do FlatList. Okay, so FlatList, that's self-closing, and then it's going to take in a few props. First is going to be the data that we want it to use. So, I mean, this is similar to what you would use map for. You'd say notes.map, and then you'd render the JSX for each one. So that's what this is essentially doing under the hood, but we just plug in the data, which in this case is going to be notes. And then we want to add a key extractor. So this has to do with having a unique key for each item. So we want to set this to a function that takes in an item, which is a note, and we want to set the key to item dot and then the ID. All right, and then the last thing we want to add here is render item, and this is where we actually return the JSX that we want to display. So this will take in an object where we destructure the item, and then here we'll just open some parentheses, and what I want to show for each one is going to be a view. We'll give it a style, let's say styles dot, and we'll call this note item. Okay, and then we want to close that view. And then inside the view we'll have text. So let's say text component, and as far as style goes, we'll do styles dot, and then let's call this note text. Okay, and then what we want to actually display is going to be from the item, the text field. So these right here. All right, yeah, so if I save that, now we can see each node on the screen. Now it doesn't look too good, so I'm just going to grab not the CSS, but the styling. So just note item, flex direction, background color of gray, making the note text bigger so it'll look like this. All right, now we want to add a button to add a new note. And ultimately, when we click that button, it's going to open a modal, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But let's create the button, which we're going to use touchable opacity again. Okay, so let's go under the flat list. And let's say touchable opacity. Okay, and as far as the text, we're just going to say put a plus sign and then add note. But we want to add to this, actually, I'm sorry, that needs to be in a text component. We'll do that in a second. But let's add style, styles dot, and button, or let's call it add button. Okay, and then inside that we'll have our text component, and that will do plus and then add note, style, let's set that to styles dot add button text. Okay, and then we'll come down here and I'm just gonna add those styles. Okay, so our add button, and I'm positioning it absolute, I'm putting it down at the bottom. So no matter how, even if there's only one note, it'll be at the bottom instead of right under it. I think that's just a better look. So the button, it doesn't do anything. You can see when I click it, it blinks. That's that touchable opacity effect. But now what we want to do is use a modal to add a new note. So for that, we're going to bring in two new components. One is Modal from React Native, and then one is going to be the text input, because we need a way to add the new note. And then we're going to add a couple new pieces of state. So let's say const, and this is going to be if the modal is visible or not. So we'll call it modal visible, set modal visible, and set that use state. And it's going to be obviously false by default. And then we're also going to have a piece of state for the new note, which by default will be an empty string. So let's say new note, whoops. And this pertains to what is being typed in the text input. So set new note. All right, so those are the new pieces of state we need. Now, let's come down here to the button to add, and this, I just want this to open the modal. So what we'll do is add an on press, right? And then that's going to call a function, and then we're going to do set modal visible and set it to true because we want that modal to open, right? Then we're going to add the modal right here. Okay, so we're going to say modal, and that's going to be, it's not self-closing, whatever the content of the modal you put inside, but we want to add some props to this modal. One is going to be if it's visible, and that visible is going to be a true or false, and it's going to depend on the modal visible state, right? Then we can also add an animation type, which I'm going to do slide, just so it'll just like slide in. I'm going to make it transparent, and then on request close, meaning that when we close the modal, what do we want to happen? Well, we want to set modal visible back to false. Okay, we want to change that piece of state. Now, as far as what the modal shows, it's going to be the text input and then a add button and a cancel button. And we want to wrap those in a view. So let's say view style, set that to styles dot, and then we'll call this modal overlay. Okay, because it wraps everything. And let's see, in that we're going to have another view, and for that style, we're going to call that modal, let's say modal content, right? And then in the modal content, we're going to have our title, so let's say text, style, set that to styles dot, and we'll call this modal title. Okay, and it's just going to say add a new note. And then underneath that, we're going to have our text input component, which is self-closing, and we're going to add a few things here. So the style will be styles dot, and we'll just say input. Okay, then we can have a placeholder, which is going to say enter note dot dot dot. We can do a placeholder text color, which I'm just going to make a light gray, so we'll do AAA. And then the value of this is going to pertain to the new note state. And then on change text, so when you start to type in that, we need to call the set new note. Okay, so that's our input. And we should be able to see this if I save it and we click that. Okay, it's not styled, so it's just this piece of text here and the input, which you just really can't see. So we'll just continue on with this. The only other things we want to add is the two buttons. So right under the text input, let's open a view and let's say style, set that to styles dot and then modal buttons. Okay, and then we're going to have our first button, so touchable opacity, and let's add to it style. This is going to be our cancel button, so we'll say styles dot cancel. Yeah, we'll do cancel button. And then on press, so when we press the cancel button, we're going to have a function, and then it's going to just set, we want to set the modal visible, we want to set that to false, right? Because we're canceling, so we want to close the modal. And then inside the touchable opacity will be a text component, and for the style for that, it's going to be cancel button text, and we'll just say cancel for the actual text. All right, so yeah, I think that should do it. Now, for the add button, we'll just copy this touchable opacity down, and then we'll just change this stuff around. So instead of cancel button, it'll be add. Not add, save. Say save button, and let's see. This will be save button text, and then instead of cancel, save. Now when we press this, obviously we don't want to just close the modal. We're going to have a function called add note. So for the on press, just set it directly to add note. Now add note doesn't exist, so we're going to get an error that says that. So I'm going to, actually, you know what, before we even do that, I'm just going to get rid of that for a second, because I want to just show you what the modal looks like. So we just need to add the styling. So down here, I'm going to just copy and paste the modal styles, which again, if you want to just copy from the repo, you can, or if you want to type it out. So just to go through it real quick, we have the modal overlay, transparent background, modal content, modal title, the input, the modal buttons, so just flex direction row, cancel button text, save button text. So let's save that. Let's come back over here, click add note, and there we go. So that looks pretty good. And again, it's going to look a little different depending on if you're on iOS or Android or the web app. So now we want to be able to add it. And again, we're not using Appwrite just yet. So we're just going to add it to the UI, meaning that when you reload the app, it's going to go away. It's not going to persist. So for the save, right, touchable opacity for the save, let's say on press, and just like we had before, we're just going to call add note, and then we'll add that up here. So up at the top, let's put it right below the state. We'll say add new note, and const add note. All right, so what we want to do first is just make sure that there's text. So I'm going to say if new note, which is the state for the input, and we'll just trim that. So if new note trim, if that's equal to nothing, then we just want to return. Okay, so that'll prevent empty notes. And then if it's not empty, then we're going to call set notes. And when you call set whatever from use state, it can be a direct value or it can be a function with the previous value. So let's add in here prev notes, and then what we want to return is going to be an array, and we're going to have the previous notes, so we're going to spread that with the spread operator, and then we want to add the new note, so that'll be an object. And for now, for the ID, I'm just going to use we'll say date.now.toString. Later on, it'll be from Appwrite, which creates the ID for you, or we create it through the SDK rather, but for now we'll just use this. And then the text is going to be the new note, whatever is typed in the input. Then we want to, we want to go under set notes, so right here, and let's do set new note, which is the input, because we want to reset that to just be an empty string. And then we want to set modal visible to false because we want to close that. All right, so now let's go over here, add note, and I'm just going to say, I don't know, I'll say Brad's note. Save, and there we go. So now it gets added. If I come down and hit R and reload, then that's going to go away, obviously, because it's not persisting anywhere. It's just being added to the UI. But I think that this is a good place to start implementing our back end with Appwrite. But before we do that, I think we can split this up into some components because we have quite a bit of output here, the modal, the list, the item. I think we can put those in their own components. So let's create a folder in the root called components. And then in that, we'll create a new file called, let's do note item.jsx. And let's create note list.jsx. And then the last one we'll create is we'll say add note modal. note.jsx. Okay, and we'll start with the note item, which is just, each item will be its own component. And all it's going to be is what we're rendering from the FlatList, which is this, right? So what we can do is just copy this or cut it. You can just copy it for now. And then in note item, we'll create a new React component. So note item, right? And it's going to take in a prop of note. And then in the return, I'm going to paste in what I just copied. And instead of item.text, it's going to be note.text because it's going to be the note that's passed in, right? And then we just need to bring in view and text. So we want to bring in view and text. All right, so that's our note item. Now, our note list component will be this flat list. So what we can do is just cut this whole thing. I'll just put a comment here because this is where we're going to want to put this note list. If I save, this is going to go away for now. And then in note lists, let's do SFC, and we'll say note list. And as far as props, it's going to take in the array of notes. And then what I want to return is going to be a view. Bring that in from React Native. And in that view, I'm going to paste in my flat list. And instead of rendering this, we want to render the item. So let's import the note item. And then instead of doing that, we can get rid of the parentheses as well. And we can just render note item and then pass in note and pass in the item as the note. Okay. Now we can use this note list in our index, in our home note screen. So we need to bring it in. So up at the top here, let's import note list. And I'm just going to use the alias here instead, like that. And let's see, where we have the comment, we'll then just say note list and pass in the notes prop, which is going to come from the state of the home screen component. FlatList doesn't exist, so we just need to make sure we bring in here FlatList. And styles doesn't exist. Oh, so the styles of the note list, let's see, actually, where do I want to put? For the note list, I don't think we don't need any styles for this. It's the item, the note item. So note item and note text, I'm going to grab that from the screen. So right here, note item and note text, we'll cut that, right? And then we'll go back to note item and let's bring in style sheet. And then down here, let's say const styles style sheet dot create, paste that in, save it, and there we go. And just to test it, so it still works. Good. All right, so now the last component is the modal. So, and that's going to clear this up quite a bit. Let's, how do I want to start this? Let's first off copy all the imports here from React Native. And in here, we want, because I think we need all of these, right? View, text. Yeah, I think we need all these except for a flat list. And then let's create a React component. Let's call it add note modal. All right, and then it's going to take in a bunch of things because it needs to work with the state of the home screen. So it's going to take in modal visible. Okay, so modal visible, and then set modal visible. And then the new note, set new note, and also the add note. All right, now back from the index from the screen here, you can get rid of flat list here. We're going to grab the whole modal, which is right here. So this, I'm going to just cut that, and then let's put that in here, paste that in. All right, and then we'll save that. We also want the styles. So from index, let's grab from here modal overlay down to the last style. So we'll grab that, and then back in the modal, let's say const styles, and we're going to set that to style sheet dot create, and then I'm going to just paste in all those styles, and I think we should be good. So we need to obviously bring that into the index. So up at the top here, we no longer need modal and text input. Let's import, add note modal, and I'm just going to use the alias here, so @/, and then we want to just add it where the comment is right here, so add note modal, and remember we need to pass all that stuff in. So let's add, we want to do modal visible, set modal visible. Wait a minute here. Modal visible, we want to set that to modal visible, and then we also want to do set modal visible. Okay, and then we want, what else? New note. New note, and then set new note, because all these are being called in that, in that component. So set new note, and then add note. All right, so let's try it out. Make sure everything still works. Okay, it gets added, good. So now it's the same, obviously it's same functionality, but this is cleaned up more, right? This return is much cleaner. If you wanted to keep it all in the same file, you could, but I think breaking things up into components, it just makes your code a lot neater. All right, so now we're ready to start to implement our back end with Appwrite. So now we're going to set up Appwrite, and this is extremely easy, and Appwrite is very powerful, and it gives you an entire back end, a database, authentication, file storage, serverless functions. It's comparable to something like Firebase or Supabase, and the free tier is very generous and is much more than what you need for this project. So you don't have to pay anything or anything like that. And you can just log right in with GitHub. So I'm going to go to appwrite.io, go to console, and I'm just going to click sign with GitHub, and it should just bring me right in. And then from here, what you're going to want to do is create a project. Okay, and I'm going to call this Notes Project, and then the project ID, if you don't put anything, it will get generated, but it'll be just a bunch of random characters. So you're going to want to put like notes-project, something like that. And remember this stuff because we need to plug it into our application, into the environment variables. So we'll click next. Right now, Frankfurt is the region, the only region, so we'll select that. And then it's going to bring us to our dashboard, and from here, we need to add a platform, right? So if you're building for web or Flutter, Android, Apple, and then notice there's a React Native option. So we're going to select that, and I'm going to call this Notes. Let's call this Notes, and I have Android selected. If you're only building for Android, then you could just do this once. If you want to build for both, then you're going to do this again with iOS, which is what I want to do. So for Android, I'm going to say Notes Android. Yeah, I guess Notes, or no, let's say Notes app Android. And then for the package name, you want to remember this as well. I'm going to say Notes-app-Android. Okay, so all lowercase with hyphens. So next, this, we can copy this. This is just the npx command to install the SDK, which is called React Native Appwrite. So you can just copy that. We'll use it in a few minutes. And then we're going to do this later, so just leave that as is. Go to dashboard. All right, now you're going to want to do the same thing for iOS. So down here, again, add platform, React Native, and we're going to choose iOS. And let's say Notes app, Notes app iOS, and then the bundle ID will say Notes app-iOS. Okay, just click next, next. Okay, so we've added both platforms. Now, what we want to do is create our database. So let's go to Databases, Create Database, call it Notes.db, and then the database ID, I'm going to call Notes-db, or Notes app-db. And then from here, we can create a collection. So a collection is kind of like a table if you're using a relational database. If you've used MongoDB before, then you should be familiar with a collection. And it holds documents. That's what our data is stored as, is basically like JSON documents. So let's create a collection for our notes. And the collection ID, make sure that you put notes for that as well, because again, we have to plug this stuff in. Now, as far as the attributes go, we want to click here. An attribute is basically a field, and an ID will be automatic, so we don't have to add that. But along with an ID, we want a text field, which I'm going to choose string, and then call it text. The size, I'll just say 255, required, and create. And then the only other thing I want aside from that is a created at, so I'm going to do date time, and let's say created at, choose null for the default, and then create. All right, and that's it. I mean, if you were building a larger application, you'd have more attributes here, but I want to just keep this simple. Now, the next thing is important, and that's the permissions. So if you go to your database, so NotesDB, and go to settings, and actually, no, that's not right. We want to go to our collection, not the database. So let's go back to our notes collection, and then settings. And then from here, you have this permissions. Right now, nobody's able to access the notes in the database. So we're going to click plus, and I'm going to select any. And I'm going to say that anyone can create, read, update, and delete. Now, that's not ideal, but for now, I'm just going to make it public so that anybody can do this. But later on, when we add authentication, we'll come back and uncheck these and add a role of a user so that only registered users can create notes or read, update, delete, all that stuff. But let's just do any with full CRUD for now. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is in the collection, we can actually add data by creating a new document. So I'm just going to say Appwrite note 1, just so we know when we fetch the notes that it's coming from Appwrite. And then we can just select whatever, a date. So that adds one. Let's create one more. We'll say Appwrite note 2, and again, just select whatever. Okay, so now we have 2 notes in our database, and now we need to integrate our backend with our React Native app. Okay, so first thing that we should do is create our environment variables with all the stuff that we just created. So in the root, we're going to create a .env. And then before we do anything there, let's go to our .getignore, because you're not going to want to push this to GitHub or anything. So let's add in .env here. Okay, now as far as what we want to name these, with Expo, we can do Expo_public and then Appwrite. So all of our variables will start with this, and we want to do the endpoint. Now the endpoint you can find in, let's see, I think if we go to our project, so notes project and then settings, so right here, this is the API endpoint, Cloud Appwrite IO version 1. I'm going to copy that, and then we're going to add that here. Okay, the next thing we want is the project ID, which I called notes-project, and we want to change this to project_ID. Okay, the next thing we need is the database ID, which I called notes, what I call it? Actually, what's the project ID? Is it? Yeah, notes project. And then I called the DB notes app DB, I believe. And this is going to be DB ID. Okay, next thing is the notes collection ID, which is going to be notes. and change that to call underscore notes ID. Then we want the bundle ID and the package name, and that has to do with Android and iOS. So let's change this one to bundle ID, and this pertains to the iOS app. So this, or if you remember, I called Notes app and then iOS. Then we want the package name, which pertains to Android, so that's going to be Android, or whatever you called it. So this will be, instead of bundle ID, this will be the package underscore name. And that should do it, all right? So that's our .env. Now we need to install the SDK, so I'm going to just open a new terminal for that. And do I still have it in my clipboard? No, I don't. So when we created it, remember we copied it, but we can just type it out. So we're going to do npx, so npx expo, and then install, and it's called react-native-appwrite. And then we also want to install the URL polyfill for React Native, so it's react-native-URL- one L in polyfill. Yeah, so we want to run that. And that's what installs the SDK that allows us to communicate with Appwrite. All right, so now what we want to do is configure the SDK, and I'm going to create a folder in the root called services. Now, the way that this is going to work, that I'm going to structure this, is we'll have our Appwrite config file, which will bring everything in that we need, the client, and then we're going to have a database service to do CRUD with the database. And it's not going to have anything to do with notes, because we'll have a separate note service that uses the database service. The database service will be encapsulated code that we can reuse. And if you were to add on like categories or any other kind of resource, you could use the database service. So we'll have database service, note service, and then later when we add authentication, we'll also have an auth service. So let's start off with the Appwrite configuration. So we'll say appwrite.js. And from here, we want to import a couple things from the SDK, including client to initialize the client, and databases, since we're using a database. So that'll be from, and then it's React Native Appwrite. Okay, now we want to create our config object, which is going to basically use all those environment variables that we just added. So we want to describe the endpoint, which we can get with process.env and what is it, Expo public Appwrite and endpoint. Okay, and then I'm going to copy that down. Next thing we need is the project ID. So here, project ID, and we want to change this to project underscore ID. Then we want the database ID, so change that to DB ID, and change this to DB ID, or sorry, just DB. And then we want the collections. So this is going to be an object. We only have one collection of notes, so we're going to say notes, and then we want process.env.expo public Appwrite underscore, and then call underscore, what was it, call notes underscore ID. Let me just double check that. So Appwrite call notes ID, yeah. Call notes ID. Okay. So now what we want to do is initialize the client. So let's say const client, set that to new client, and that's going to get, we're going to add on to this dot set endpoint, get rid of that semicolon. So set endpoint, and then we pass in our config object and then the endpoint. And then we want to do the same with the project ID. So this will be .set project and then config dot and then project ID. Right? Now we want to use a database, so we need to initialize that. So let's say const databases, or just database, and we want to set that to new databases, which we brought in from the SDK, and that takes in the client. All right, then we just want to export from this file the database object, which we'll use in the database service, the config object, and the client. All right, now the last thing we need to do here is check the platform that we're on and set it to either the bundle ID or the package name, depending on if we're on iOS or Android. And the way you can do that, React Native gives us a platform object to check what the app is being ran on. So let's say bring in platform from React Native, and then let's go down right below where we added the client here, and I'm going to use a switch, and we'll say switch and then platform.os, because that'll give us either iOS or Android or whatever other options there are. And then let's say if the case is iOS, then we're going to want to call client.setPlatform, and then we'll pass in here the process.env.expo public Appwrite underscore, and then it's the bundle ID, because remember with iOS it's called a bundle ID, and then we just want to break. Okay, and then I can just copy that case down and then change that to Android, and then we want to set it to the package name. Okay, so Appwrite underscore and then package underscore name. And that's it. That should do it as far as the config goes. Now, let's start to create our database service. So in services, we'll create a new file called database service.js. And from here, we want to import the database object that we just initialized in the Appwrite file. So let's say database from ./Appwrite. Then we want to create an object called database service, and this is where we're going to have all of our functions to do CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. We're going to start with just reading or listing, let's say listDocuments. And remember, this is reusable, meaning it's not going to have anything to do with notes. We'll have a separate note service for that. So these are going to be async functions. Let's call this listDocuments, and this is going to take in a database ID and a collection ID. And then we want to do a try catch, and we want to then use that database object. So let's say const response and then await on the database dot, and there's a function called, it's a method called listDocuments. Now I called this listDocuments, but this could be anything. You could call it getDocuments or whatever. This is actually part of the SDK of the database object. Okay, and it also takes in the database ID and the collection ID. So we'll get the response, and then let's return response.documents. So there'll be an object with the documents, and then I'm just going to say, or an empty array. Okay, so if there are none, we'll just return an empty array. Now if there's an error, then I'm going to do a console.error, and we'll say error fetching documents, right? And then we'll also add here the error.message. So that'll be the log, and then what we want to return if there's an error is an object with the error. Okay, and then I'm going to come down here to the very bottom and export default database service. And that's all I'm going to do for now. We'll have like the create, the update, delete, but I don't want to type all that out now because we're not dealing with it now. Let's do one thing at a time. So we have our list documents. Now we need to create our note service and the getNotes that uses this list document. So let's create a new file called noteservice.js. Okay, and then what we want to bring in from here is our database service. Okay, so let's say import database service. All right, and then also for the ID, we can bring that in from the SDK. There's this ID object that will create a unique ID for us. Then we want to define the Appwrite database and collection ID. So let's say const db ID. And we can get that from here. What is it? db underscore ID. Then we'll copy that down. We want the call ID. And I believe that is call notes. Or is it notes call? Let me just check that. So call notes ID. Call notes ID. All right. So now we're going to create our note service object. So note service, and then we're going to have our getNotes. So let's say async getNotes, and from here we want to use our database service. So response and then await database service dot list documents. That's going to take in the DB ID and the call ID. And then what we'll do is check for the error, because remember we're returning an object with an error if there is one. So let's say if that response object has an error, then we're also going to return from here an error, which will be the response dot error. And then if there's no error, we want to just simply return an object with a data property, and that's going to be the response. All right, so save that, and we just need to export. So export default note service. And again, we'll have more functions in here later, but I just want to get the notes displayed first. So now in the index, this is the home screen. Instead of just showing these, right, because we're just showing the hard-coded notes, let's make this just an empty array. Okay, and if I save that, those are going to go away. And then we want to use our note service. So let's import our note service. I'm just going to use @ here. All right, and then I want to just include a couple new pieces of state. So one is going to be loading. So let's say loading and set loading. And the default for that, I'm going to set that to true. And then I also want to have for the error, which is going to be null by default. So let's say set error. Okay, and we're going to be using useEffect to make the request. So let's say useEffect, bring that in. And let's go down right below the state and say useEffect. And we want our dependency array, which is just going to be an empty array. And in here, we're going to call fetch notes, which I'm going to create now. And I'm going to create it below useEffect. You could create it within the useEffect if you want. It doesn't really matter. So let's say fetch notes. It's going to be async. And I want to set loading to true. And then let's say const response. And we want to set that equal to await. And then we're going to use our note service. And then .get, I don't know why it's not showing up, but getNotes. And let's see, we'll check if there's an error, because remember, that response, that object will have an error in the object if something goes wrong. And if that happens, then I want to call the state here, set error, and pass in the response.error. And then I also want to alert the user, and there's this alert from React Native that we can use. It has an alert method, and we'll just alert with error, and then also the response.error. Okay, else, if there's not an error, then we want to get the data and set that to the notes state. So set notes, and set that to response.data, and then set error to null. And then finally, under the if statement, set loading to false. And let's see what's going on here. That's from an earlier log. I'm just going to reload this. Okay, so that's working. Now, you're going to see this, each child in a list should have a unique key. The reason that we're seeing that is because now in the database, the ID field is not called ID, it's called $ID. And if we go to our note list component, where is it? Components, note list, where we have our key extractor, we're using ID. So all we need to do here is add a $, and that should get rid of that error. All right, and we're seeing Appwrite note 1 and 2, which means that it's coming from the database. Now, if I add a note, it's not going to add it yet because we haven't added that functionality. It will add it to the UI, but it'll go away when I reload. So we want to make that stick and persist to the database. So let's start off in the database service, and that's kind of the flow that we're going to go with is doing our database service, our note service, and then our component stuff. Okay, so let's start off at the database service and do, what are we going to call this? We'll call this just create document. Okay, so I'm going to go under this list document right here, and let's say, we'll put a comment, create, we don't really need comments here, but whatever. And then let's do async create document. Okay, now this is going to take in a few things. So it'll be the database ID, the collection ID, the data itself, and then the ID, which I'm going to set a default of null, not mull. Okay, and then in here, let's do a try catch, and we want to return, let's return and then await, and we're going to use the database object from the SDK, which has a create document method, and that takes in the DB ID, collection ID, ID or undefined, and then the data. Okay, so if something goes wrong, then let's do a console.error, and we'll say error creating document with the message. Okay, and then we want to return an object with an error, which will be the error.message. So that's it. That's our create document. So now we want to go into our notes, right, or our note service rather, and we want to create an add note. So let's go under getNotes, say add new note, and we'll say async add note, and it's going to take in the text, and let's check for the text. So if not text, then we're going to return an error or an object with an error, and that error will say note, what should we say here? Note text cannot be empty. Yeah, and then if it's not empty, then we're going to create a data object, and that data object will have the text, and it'll have the created at, which I'm going to set that to new date. So we'll do new date and then just add on to that to ISO string. All right, then under the data object, we want to call await and then use our database service. We want to use the create document function method that we just created. And then in that, we're going to add a few arguments here. So database ID, collection, and data. And then for the ID, we're going to use that ID object that I brought in, which has a method called unique. Okay, so that ID, I brought that in from the SDK, and that will give us a unique ID. All right, now after that create document, let's check for an error. So say if response, I'm going to use the optional chaining here. So if response error, then let's return that response.error. Okay, and then if there's not an error, then we're just going to return data, which will be the response, which will be the added note. Okay, so now we want to use that within our note screen, so note index file, and we already have the add note right here, but all it's doing is adding it to the UI. So we want to just change this up a little bit. Let's just get rid of this. We still want to check to make sure that the text is there. We still want to, set it back to the default, but we want to interact with Appwrite. So let's say const response and set that to await, and then we want to use our note service, and then we want to call add note and pass into that the new note. Okay, now we have to make this add note asynchronous. Okay, because we're using await here. So we want to do that, and then we want to check for an error. So let's say if the response object has an error on it, then we want to alert the user. So alert.alert, and we'll pass in the text of error and also the response.error. So we'll do that. Else, if there's not an error, then we want to set the notes, and we want to set it to an array. We'll spread across the current notes, and then also add on the new one, which is going to be in the response object in a data property. All right, so let's try this out. I'm just going to reload for good luck. So get started, and then add note, and let's say Brad's note. Save. Okay, it gets added to the UI, and it should be added to Appwrite as well. If I reload, I should still see it there, which I do. And you can check within Appwrite as well. I don't know what that is. Within Appwrite, if I go to my database, go to my notes collection, there it is. Okay, and you can see the ID got generated as well. So now we can add notes. Now, one thing we didn't account for is the loading and error. We set it when we made the request, but we're not doing anything with it. So let's handle that. I'm going to come down to the return and replace this note list because I want to check for loading and I want to check for error. So we'll get rid of that, and then let's say if loading, then do something else, or show something else, show something else. Okay, and what I want to show if it's loading is an activity indicator, which is like a spinner or whatever. And you can bring that in from React Native. So let's say activity indicator, and that should bring it in right here from React Native. And that can take in, oops, we want to put bracket there. So that can take in a size, which I'm going to set that to large. And then also a color, which I'm going to set to say 007 BFF, so a blue color, and we'll close that off. All right, so it'll show the activity indicator if it's loading. If it's not loading, if it's done, then let's open up a fragment here, and let's say if there's an error, then we're going to show a text component, and let's give that a style. Let's give that a style of styles.errorText. And then inside that, we'll show whatever is in the error state. Okay, and then right under that is where we'll do our set notes. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Oh. And then under that we'll say, not set notes, note list. Okay, so what we had there before. So notes. So we're actually just checking loading first, and we're checking the error. And for the styling for error text, let's just add that real quick. So down here, error text, and I'm just going to set that to, let's say, color. We'll do color red, and let's do text align to center. Oops. And then let's do, what else? Margin bottom, say 15, or let's do 10, and then the font size 16. Okay, and you saw that little spinner there. That was the activity indicator. You can it just shows for a millisecond, but it is there. All right, so now next thing, I want to be able to delete a note. So I want to have a little delete icon next to each item that we can click and we can delete. So let's start off by, again, going to the database service, and we'll add the function here, then we'll do the note service, and then we'll do the UI, the component. All right, so for the database service, let's add under create, say delete note, or delete document, sorry, because this, this only pertains to documents. This isn't note specific. So async delete document, and that's going to take in the DB ID, call ID, and the ID of the document. Then we're going to do open up a try catch, and we're just going to await. We don't have to return this. We just want to do the delete. So let's say database, because we're using the database object from the SDK, and then there's a delete document, which is going to take in same stuff, the DB ID, collection, and ID. Okay, and then all I'm going to do is return an object with success and set that to true. And then if there's an error, we'll just grab this. So error, deleting document, and yeah, that should do it. So now we want to add our note service functions. Let's go to note service, and let's see, we want to go under the add note, which ends here. Okay, and we're gonna async, and let's call this delete note, and that's just going to take in the note ID. And then let's do const response await. We want to use the database service, and then we want delete document. That takes in the DB ID, collection ID, and the ID. And it's, oh, you know what, it also, no, that should be good. Yeah, so now let's check for an error. So if the response dot error, then return okay, and then if there's not an error, then we're just going to return data, which will be the response. Oh, wait a minute. You know what? No, we just, well, I guess we could do that, but we could just send back success true, because there actually is no data. So let's just say success true. Okay, so we'll save that. Now we need to implement this into our UI. So we need to have an icon, right? We need a delete icon, and then when we click that, we want to call that note service. So let's see, we're going to put this Where do we want to go here? Actually, we want to do this in the note item. That's right. We separated it into components. So note item. We have a view and we have our text. So let's go right under the text right here. And let's do a touchable opacity. And we'll bring that in from React Native. So we got touchable opacity, and then let's do an on press, and we're going to set that. It's going to be set to a function that calls the on delete, which we'll create. So on delete, and that's going to take in the note ID, which is money sign ID, like that. Okay, and that note, that on delete, will have to pass up. So let's add that here in the note item, say on delete. And then for what we want to display here, let's do text. So text and style. I'm going to set that to styles.delete. And I'm going to just use an icon, which I'm just pasting in. I mean, you can use whatever you want, or you can just copy the icon from the code. And for the styles, very simple. I'm just going to add, did I call it delete? What did I call it? Yeah, just delete. So delete, and let's just do font size, say font size 18, and color red. Okay, so now we have our icons. And right now it's not, we'll get an error because that on delete isn't working. So we now need to go into the note list, because remember, the note item is embedded here in the note list. So we have to account for that here. So let's go and pass in on delete as a prop and set that to on delete, which then we have to pass up again into the index file. So here we want on delete. All right, and then we want to go to where the note list is being embedded, which is the index file, so right here, and let's say on delete, and set that to, let's say, delete note. Then we want to add that function, so let's go up, let's go under add note, so const delete note. Set that to async. All right, so this is going to take in the ID. And I want to do an alert, like a confirmation. And we can do that with alert dot and then the alert method. And it's pretty cool how we can do this. So this takes in the title of the alert, the message, and then the buttons, including the text of the button, the style of the button, and the on press. So we can just format all that within here. So first off is the title. So let's say delete note, and then the message, which is going to be, are you sure you want to delete this note, right? And then what we can do is pass in an array, and we're going to have an object that has the text for the first button, which is going to be the cancel. So cancel, and then the style for it, which will also just say cancel. And then the next button will be the delete, so we want another object, and it will know just to cancel, just to close it. And then this text is going to be delete, and then the style, we're going to use destructive, which will make it into a red button. And then we can have our on press, which is what we want to happen. So that'll be an async function. And in that is where we want to use our note service. So let's say response equals await. And we want to use our note service dot and then delete note, pass in the ID. Okay, we want to check for the error. if there is an error, then we'll just do another alert. Let's do response dot error. Okay, and then else, if there's not an error, then we want to set notes. And we want to get rid of the one that we click on, so we'll use filter. We'll say our note state, we want to then filter. And we'll say for each note, let's filter note.moneySignID, where it's not equal to the ID that's passed in. So that should do it. So let's try it out. I'm going to come over here, click Brad's note. I get the confirmation, looks nice, in the iOS style. Delete, goes away. If I come down here and reload, the note's gone. So now we can create, read, and delete. Now we want to be able to update the note. So this is probably the more tricky one. What I want to do is have an edit button. When we click it, I then want the text to become like an input, a text input where we can edit, and then we'll have a save icon, and we can click that and it'll actually save it in Appwrite. So let's get started with that. Now, just like with the other, the other functionalities, we're going to start in the database service with the update, which is very simple. I'm actually going to put the update above the delete. So right here, say update document. Okay, let's say async and update document. I can't spell document, apparently. So update document, which is going to take in the DB ID, collection ID, ID of the document, and the data. Just make sure you put a comma there. All right, so let's say try catch, and I'm going to return. So let's return, and then we want to await, use the database object here with update document from Appwrite, DB ID, call ID, ID, and data. Okay, then if something goes wrong, then we'll just do what we've been doing. So just grab this. Okay, I'll just say error updating. And that's it. So very simple. I mean, you can see how the SDK is just very clean and easy to use. Now we want to create our note service update, which is also pretty simple. So let's go to note service. And I'll put this above the delete note. So async. Okay, and this is going to take in just the ID and the text. All right, then from here, let's do const response await, and then the database service. And we're going to call the update document, pass in our DB ID and call ID, which we have up at the top of this file, and then the ID, and then we need the data. So I'm going to pass in an object with the text. All right, and then after that, we just want to check for an error. And return. Okay, and then if there's not an error, then we're just going to return data like that. So now what we want to do is add an edit button to each of these items. So we want to open up the note item component. And we'll just close this other stuff for now. And there's quite a bit we have to add here because we're going to have a state of on is editing. And if it is editing, then we want this to be a text input that we can edit. And we'll have a save button if it is editing. If it's not is editing, then we'll just have the edit icon that we can click to change it to is editing, if that makes sense. All right, so we're going to need some state here. So in note item, let's import use state. And let's see, we're going to add our state right here. So const, and let's say we want is editing, and set is editing. And the default for that is going to be false. And then we also want to have the edited text, so whatever we're typing in. So let's say edited text and set edited text. So use state, and that's going to be, by default, it'll just be the note text, whatever it is. Okay, and then I'm also going to be using a ref here because on blur, right, meaning if this is an input and I click outside of it, I also want to call the save, right? So I'm going to bring in use ref, and then I'm going to initialize that here. We'll call this input ref, set that to use ref, and pass in null. Okay, now what we want to do is come down into the view, and let's open up some curly braces, and let's say if it is editing, so if it is editing, then we want to show the text input. Okay, so in these curly braces, let's say text, the text input component, which you want to bring in from React Native, and then we want to add a bunch of stuff to that, so including the ref, which is going to be the input ref. And then underneath that, we're going to do the style, which is going to be styles.input. And then under that, we're going to do the value. And the value is going to be the edited text. Okay, and then on change text, then we're going to want to call set edited text. I'm also going to add an autofocus, and on submitting, on submit editing, then I want to call the handle save function, which we're going to create in a minute. And then the return key type, we'll set that to done. Okay, now after the parentheses, we'll say else, meaning that if it's not in the editing state, then we're simply going to want to show the text, which is this right here. So we'll just bring this up into the else of the ternary. Okay, now it's not going to change anything yet because it's not in the edit. We have no way to put it into this editing state. So that's what we want to do now, is come down. Let's see. We want to go. Actually, you know what? Underneath this, so where this is editing ends, underneath it right now is just the delete button. I'm going to add here a view. So a view with a style of styles.actions. And then we want to put this, the delete button, we want to put that in the view at the bottom, and we're going to put some other stuff up here. So I want to check to see if it's editing, because if it is, then we want to show a save icon. If it's not, we want to show the edit or the pencil icon. So if is editing, let's open up some parentheses, and we want to have a touchable opacity. Okay, so this is going to, let's see, so this is going to be the save button. So let's add an on press. And when it's pressed, we're going to want to have a function, and we're going to actually have, we're going to do two things. We're going to call handle save, okay? But we also want to, on the input ref, we want to do input ref current dot blur. So basically, if they click outside of the text input, then we want it to go back to normal, right? We want it to not be a text input anymore. So this is going to be a text component inside of the touchable opacity. And I'm going to just have a save little disk icon, which I'm going to just grab real quick. And you can grab it from the code, or you can use something else, whatever you want. And let's just give it a style So styles dot, and let's call this edit. Okay, now we want to have our else. So after that parentheses, we'll have the else, and this is where we want to have the edit icon, which I'm just going to copy the delete, paste that in, and then change this to edit. And then we're going to have a little pencil icon. Okay, and this is what's going to trigger the set is editing. So instead of on delete, we want to get rid of that, and we want to call set is editing to true. All right, so if I save that, now we can see the pencil icon. Now this doesn't look very good, so we just got to add a couple styles. So for actions, which wraps all the icons, we want to make sure that that flex direction is a row. So now they're next to each other. And then the edit button or edit icon, we want to make that a little bigger. So let's say font size 18. And let's do margin right, give it some space of 10. And color, we'll say blue. Oh, forgot my colon here. There we go. So that looks better. All right, now when I click this pencil icon, you'll see it says property handle save doesn't exist. So that pertains to this right here. Right, so let's create our handle save. So we'll put that, right above the return. We'll say const handle save. And then let's check, make sure that there's text. So we'll say if edited text dot trim is equal to nothing, then we just want to return. Then we want to call on edit, and on edit is something we're going to pass up to the index file so that we can then call the update from our note service. So let's say on edit and pass in the ID, so we can get that from note.$ID. And then we also need the data, which is the edited text that we want to update it to. And then we'll just set is editing to false. Okay, now that on edit is going to be passed up here. So let's say on edit, right? And then we need to basically catch that in the note list, because that's where the note item is embedded right here, just like we did with the delete. We want to say on edit and set that to on edit, and then pass that up just like we did with the delete. Okay, and then in the index, the notes index file, where we have the note list, which is, where's the note list? Right here, just like we have the on delete, on edit, we're then going to call update note, okay, just like we did with the delete, and we need to create that. That function. So let's do that right above the return. Actually, let's call it edit note. So edit note, and we'll go right here. Let's say const edit note and set that to an async function. And for now, I'm just going to return. I just want to make sure that this works. Okay, so if I click that, there we go. And you can see it changes to an input, and it also changes to a save icon. Now, it's not going to do the actual update yet. Like if I change it to 2, okay, you can see I click save, and it didn't change because we haven't added that yet. We're going to do that now right here. So in edit note, it's going to take in the ID, and it's going to take in the new text, which is the edited text that we pass in the note item. All right, so let's get rid of that, and then we're going to check, we'll say if not new text dot trim. Okay, so if that's not there, then I want to do an alert. So alert and error, and we'll say note text cannot be empty, and then we'll just return. And then if there is text, then that's where we want to use our note service. So response equals await note service dot, and we want to call the update. Do we call it update note? Let's see, note service, yeah, update note. See, so it gets passed in ID and text. So update note, pass in ID and the new text. All right, then we want to check for an error. So response.error. If there is an error, then again, we'll do an alert. And for the alert, we'll just okay, and then let's go, well, let's put an else. Okay, so if there's no error, then we want to set our notes. And this is a little tough because we're only updating the text, right? The notes have an ID, text, and created at. We only want to update the text. So what we can do is pass in a function to the set and get the previous notes. And then what we're going to want to do is map over those. So we'll take the previous notes and do a dot map, pass in our function here. So for each note, and for each note, we want to do a condition where if the note dot ID, so we're checking for if it's the one we want to update, right? We're looping over all of them and seeing if it's the one we want to update by matching the ID like that. And if it does match, then what we want to do is have it be an object with the current note, so spread across note, but then the text, we want to update that to be the response.data, which is the note object, but we want just the text. Okay, so we're just setting the text to the new text that was added. All right, else, okay, so else, then we're not going to touch it, and it's just going to, output the note. So let's save that. Let's try it out. So I'll click Edit. I'm going to just get rid of the 1 and click the Save button. And now the 1 is gone, and if I refresh the page here, you can see it's still gone. So it updated in the database. So now we have complete CRUD, create, read, update, and delete with our Appwrite backend. So now the next task is to add authentication. So for authentication, we need to start off by changing the permissions, because if you remember, we set the notes collection to be public where anybody can create, read, update, and delete notes. And everybody will see the same notes. So that's something we have to take into account too, is authorization. So let's go to our notes, our project in the Appwrite dashboard, and go to our database, go to our notes database and our notes collection, and let's go to settings. And then under permissions, we're going to actually delete this, what we did earlier, the any, and we're going to add a new role of all users and set that to create, read, update, and delete. So this means that it has to be an authenticated user. So now what's going to happen is if we go back and we reload our application and we go to the notes page, we're going to get an error. It says the current user is not authorized to perform the request action. And that's what we want. We don't want guests to be able to even see notes. So the way we're going to do this, I'll just explain the order. So first off, we need to just add a couple lines to our Appwrite config in order to use accounts and authentication, and that's simple. Then we're going to create an auth service that will have functions to log in, register, check the user, and log out. Okay, so those will directly interact with Appwrite through the account object. And then after that, we're going to create an auth context, because we need to be able to provide our entire app, all of our components, with the user state or the auth state. So we're going to use the context API that's built into React to basically manage that state and send it down. Okay, so we'll have the auth service, the auth context, and then we need an auth screen with a form to register and log in. and then those forms will interact with the functions that are in the auth context, and those auth context functions will interact with the auth service. All right, so hopefully that makes sense, and we'll make it so that when you go to the notes page, if you're not logged in, then you get redirected to the auth, to the the login page. So first things first, we want to bring in account from React Native Appwrite, and then down at the bottom, let's see, down at the bottom, right after we initialize the database, we want to initialize account in the same way. So account equals new, uppercase A, account, and we want to pass in client, and then we just want to export account so that we can use it in our auth service. Okay, this isn't going to work for a while, so just ignore that. Actually, we'll just go back to the home page. So we can close up Appwrite.js, and now let's create a new service called Auth Service.js. And then from here, we want to import that account that we just created and exported. So this is going to be from./Appwrite. And then we also want to bring in the ID object from the SDK, because we're going to need that when we register and create a user. All right, let's see. We want to create our object, so just like we did with the other services, it's formatted the same way. And we're going to have our first function, which is going to register a user. So let's say async, and we'll call this register. Okay, now this is going to take in email and password. And what we want to do is have a try catch, and we want to interact with the account object from the SDK. So let's say const response, set that to await, and then account dot, and we want to use create. So there's a method called create, and that's going to take in an ID. So this is where we're going to use the ID object and the unique method. So the ID, and then also the email and the password, which ultimately will get passed into this function. And then we're just going to return the response. And then if there's an error, then we're going to return an object with error and set that to error.message. We'll say error.message, or then we'll just type in, let's say, register failed, or registration failed, and we'll say please try again. All right, so pretty simple. And then what I'm going to do is just copy the register function down, because the login is very similar. So let's change this to login, and that's going to take in email and password. And then instead of calling create, it's going to call a function called create email password session, which only takes in an email and password, so you want to get rid of that ID. And then same thing, return response. If there's an error, then we'll say login failed, and let's say please check your credentials. Okay, so that's the login. Then we want to get the user. So under login, let's put a comment here. We'll say get logged in user. Did I put a comment here? No. I know the function names are self-explanatory, but I like to it separates where the functions are. So let's say async get user. And all we have to do here is simply return await account, and then the get method. That'll get the current user, and we're going to return it. If there's no user, if they're not logged in, then we're going to return null. Okay. Then we have the logout. So async logout. So for that, we're just going to await account, and then there's a function called delete session. We're going to call that, and we'll pass in a string of current, so that'll delete the current session. And then for the return, I'll just copy one of these for the error. And let's see, we'll just get rid of this. We'll say logout failed. Please try again. And that's it. So now we just want to export export default auth service, and we should be good. So now that we have the auth service, we want to create the auth context, because we're not going to be using this auth service from our components. We're going to send the state down from our context, and the context interacts with the auth service. So in the root, let's create a new folder called contexts, and let's create a new file called authcontext.js. And if you've ever used the context API, then this should look really familiar. So let's start off by importing create context. So that's going to be from React. We also want the use context hook, and then we want the use state, because we're still managing our state using use state. It's just that it's global and we're sending it down to the rest of our app rather than being in a single UI component. And then we also want use effect, because we want to basically check for the user whenever the page loads. And then let's import auth service. So we want to bring that in from the services / auth service. All right, and then we want to create, let's say, auth context, set that to create context, and then we want to export a provider. So const export const, and then let's say auth provider. Now the provider is what wraps the application so that your components have access to the state that's in the context. So what gets passed in here is an object, and it's going to have children, which is going to be whatever we wrap, which is going to be our entire app within the layout, within the root layout. And then we'll create our state. So this is going to be global state, the user, and let's say use state, and the default is just going to be null. And then I just want to have a loading as well, which is going to be true by default, and set this to loading and set loading. Okay, now we want to have some functions that we pass down. So first off, we're going to have a check user. Actually, check user isn't going to be passed down. This is just how we check the user when the page loads, when every page loads. In fact, we're going to call this in the use effect. So right above it, we can say use effect and pass in our function with the dependency array, and we're just going to call check user like that. All right, and then say const check user, set that to async. Whoops. Async. And from here, let's set loading to true. And then we're going to use our auth service get user function. So let's say response, set that to await our auth service dot, and then get user. And then we'll check for an error. So let's say if response dot error, then we want to set the user to null. Okay, if there's an error, they're not logged in, set it to null. Else then we want to set the user to the response, which will be the user data. And then after that if statement, we'll set loading to false. All right, so this here, when we set user to response, that's going to be from the service, from the auth service, get user. It's going to be this. This is what ultimately gets the user from Appwrite. So we're returning that if there's no error, and then we're setting it as the user state. Okay, now we want a couple other functions that we're going to send down. So let's do our login. async. Okay, so login, and this is going to take in email, password, and let's make a request. So response, set that to await, and then auth service dot login. Pass in email, password. Okay, check for the error. Okay, so if there's an error, then we're just going to return the response, which will be an error. And if not, then we're going to await, and we're going to call check user. And then as far as what we're going to return here, we're just going to say success set to true. All right, so that's our login. And then the register is pretty similar. I guess we could just copy that. Change that to register. And that's going to take in email and password as well. And then it's going to call auth service dot register email password, check for the error. And then down here, I'm going to get rid of this because what I want to do is log right in. If they register, I want to log in right away. So what we can do is just say return, and then the login function above, just pass in the email and password. So that'll log them in. In fact, I'll put a comment here and say auto login after register. I mean, you don't have to do it that way, but I prefer to do it that way. Then we have our logout. So const logout. All right, so for the logout, we're going to just await our auth service dot logout. And then we're going to set the user to null. So we want to make sure that we clear that user no matter what. And then await and check user. All right, so that's our logout. Now we want to pass all these down so that we can run them wherever we want in our components. So the way that we do that is we return the auth, let's say auth provider dot provider. Okay, and this has nothing to do with React Native. This is React, just the context API. And this will take in a value, an object, so we want to use double curly braces. And we want to pass the user state so that we can access that. We want to pass the login function, so we can call that. The register, so we can call that. Logout and loading. So we want to be able to access all that within our app. And our app gets passed into the context as children. So we want to output that here. Okay, and then finally we want to export. And the way that we bring these in to our components is going to be through a hook called use auth. So let's say export const use auth, and then we're going to set that to use context and pass in our auth context. So now whenever you don't have to type this out, but whenever we're in a component, we should now be able to access, for instance, login from use auth like that. Okay, login, register, any of this stuff here, we should be able to do this within our components and call them. Either call the functions or get the user or loading state. Okay, so that's the context API. Now, in order for this to work, we have to wrap the rest of our app. So we're going to do that from within our main layout. So our app folder and then underscore layout, not the notes layout, the main, it should say root layout. And then we want to bring in the auth provider here. So let's import, and let's say auth provider from, and that's going to be from our slash contexts slash and then auth context. Okay, this still isn't going to work, by the way, because we're not logged in. We still need to create the screen to be able to log in. But now we need to wrap the rest of this. So right here above the stack, let's say auth provider, and then the ending auth provider tag is going to go after the ending stack tag. Element type is invalid, expected string built-in class function. Check the render method. of auth provider. Let's see. Where is it? So return auth provider. Oh, this should be auth context.provider. There we go. All right. So next step, now that we've wrapped our application, we want to have an auth screen. So let's actually, you know what? Before we do that, no, let's create it, because we want the notes page. This here, we shouldn't see this screen if we're not logged in. We should get redirected to the auth screen. And I was going to do that now, but we don't have an auth screen to redirect to. So let's just create a basic screen just so we can have it, and then we'll redirect to it. So remember, we're using the Expo router, so I'm going to create a folder in the app folder called auth. And then I'm going to give it a custom layout, just like our notes. So let's do .jsx. And then it's also going to have an index, which will be the main screen. Now the layout is going to be basically the same as notes, so we can copy the notes. It's just going to be the stack with the header shown false. So in the auth layout, paste that in, just change this and this to auth. And then we can close that up. And then in the auth index, we're going to have a bunch of stuff here, but I just want to get something. So let's just import view and text from React Native. And let's create the auth screen. And let's just put in here view style, set that to styles dot container, which we have to bring in up here. Style sheet, and let's see, we'll say const styles, set that to style sheet dot create, and then we have container. We'll do flex 1, padding 20, and background color white. All right, and then in the view, let's put a text, and just for now, I'm just going to put the word auth. Okay, so we have a screen. It's not going to show much, but we have the screen. So before we do anything else here, let's make it so that we redirect to it when we go to the notes page when we're not logged in. Okay, so let's go to notes and then index, and we're going to want to bring in two things here. One is going to be the use router hook, because we're redirecting to a different page in the stack. So let's say use router, and that's going to be from Expo router. And then we also want to import use auth, because we need to figure out if we're logged in or not. So use auth, and that's going to be from, let's say, @/context. I don't know why it's not showing up. So auth context. Just make sure that that doesn't have any other weird errors. And then what we'll do is we'll go right above the state, and let's initialize the router. So router, set that to use router. And like I said before, in order to get the global state, we can get it from use auth like this. And I can pull in what I want. And what I want to pull in is going to be the user as well as loading, but we already have a loading state locally here, so I'm just going to rename it to auth loading. All right. Okay, and then we're going to come down here and we're going to have another use effect above this one, because this is going to have different dependencies. So for the dependencies, we want this to run if user changes or the auth loading. And what we want it to do is check to see if the user is not logged in. And we can do that by saying if not auth loading. So if it's not loading and there's no user, then we want to redirect. And we can do that using the router, and we can replace the page in the stack with what we want, which is going to be auth/auth. Okay, then down in fetch notes, we want to pass user in as a dependency, and we just want to check if there's a user, then we can fetch the notes. We don't want to fetch the notes if there's no user. So let's save that, and it looks like I got redirected, but auth isn't showing up. You know what, we might just have to refresh. Get started, and there we go. So that now it works. So I'm not logged in, and remember, this button goes to notes, but it doesn't bring me to notes. It brings me to the auth screen, which is exactly what we want. Now let's just quickly change up here. I'm going to change that to just say, we'll have it say login. So we can do that in the main layout, the root layout, just like we did with the notes screen. We can copy that down, change the name to auth, and then the header title, we'll change that to login. So now we just have to create the login page and basically interact with our context functions that interacts with the service that interacts with the SDK. So let's go to our auth index.jsx, and we're going to have a form, and it's going to be a login or a register form depending on a piece of state called isRegistering. So let's bring in useState so that we can add that, and then we're going to go right above the return here, and let's say we want an email field in our state, so set email, and the default for that is just going to be an empty string. Then we're going to want the password, so let's take this and this password, and that's going to be an empty string as well. We also want confirm password. So let's say confirm uppercase P password and set confirm password, also empty string. And then we want to have an isRegistering, and this is going to be false by default because it's going to be the login form by default. So we'll set that to false. Let's call this isRegistering. Okay, and then this will be set isRegistering. Registering. Okay, and then let's do a piece of state for the error as well. So error and set error. All right, so that's our state at the moment. And now let's create a form. So we're going to come down here. Let's see, we have our container. Yeah, I guess we'll just do the styling after. So within the container, let's have a title. So we'll use the text component, and this is it's gonna have different text depending on that isRegistering, right? So let's say if isRegistering, then we want this to say sign up, else we want this to say login. And let's just give this text style, and we'll call this styles.header. Okay, so and as you can see, when I save, it says login. If I were to change the isRegistering default right here to true, then it says sign up. So we get that, we get the header. Now I want to, before we do the inputs, I want to check for an error. So we'll check the error state, and if there is an error, then we want to show a text component. Okay, so we want a text component. I'm just going to give this a style of, let's say, styles.error, and then whatever is in that error state will show here as text. Else, then this will just be null. Okay, now underneath that, we want to have our text input. We can get rid of this, and let's do text input. Okay, so this is going to be the email, which of course we want whether it's a login or register, and I'm going to give it a style, styles dot, and we'll do input. Okay, then we want to do the placeholder. We'll set that to just email. All right, and then we'll do the placeholder color. Why is this not, oh, you know what, let's bring it in up here, text input. Okay, so we get our drop downs. So I'm going to do placeholder text color, and let's make that a light color. So we'll do AAA. All right, and then we want to do the value, which is, of course, the email in the state. We want to have an on change text, and we want that to call set email. And let's do auto capitalize and set that to none. And then keyboard, I'm going to say keyboard type, and let's say email dash address. And all this is the format of the keyboard when you click on the input, and it'll have the @ and the .com, so it's set up for you to add an email address. There's a couple different values that you can use. So next we want the password, so we can take the text input, copy that down, and let's change a couple things here. So placeholder, we'll change that to password. Password. And then let's see, we'll leave the color, value, that's going to be password. Then we get the on change text, which is going to call set password. And then let's see, we don't need auto capitalize, and then we don't need that. I do want to add secure text entry. So this right here. So if true, the text input obscures the text entered so that sensitive text like password stays secure. And then I think that should do it. So if we save that, we have our inputs, but they look horrible. So we'll add the styling after. The next thing I want to do is add the password confirm, but we only want it if it's registering. So let's say if registering, then let's have our text input, which I'm just going to copy this one. And let's see, we're going to change the placeholder to confirm password. And let's change the value. Where's the value? Right here. So we'll change that to confirm password. Did I add that as state? Yeah. And then on change text will be set confirm password. So save that, and you see that it's not showing. But if I were to change the is registering to true, then it does show. Now we want to have our button. So basically we're going to have we'll have a button that will say login or sign up, and then we're also going to have some text. If we're registering, it should say already have an account. If we're logging in, it should say don't have an account, and it should have a link to either register or log in. So let's go underneath the is registering that we just did, and let's add a touchable opacity, which make sure you bring that in from React Native. And let's give it a style. We'll say styles dot and button. And we want to have a text component. Style for that is going to be styles.buttonText. And for the text, again, we want it, that depends on is registering. So if registering, then it'll say sign up, else it'll say login. Okay, and you can see for us it says login. And then we want to have, like I said, it should say don't have an account, log in, or don't have an account, or sorry, already have an account, log in, or don't have an account, sign up. So underneath that, we're going to do another touchable opacity. And let's do, we don't have to have any styles on this, but let's add our on press. Okay, so on press is going to be a function, and we just want to change the is registering. So we'll say set is registering and change it to the opposite of whatever it is. So opposite of is registering. Okay, and then let's add our text. Actually, we can just copy this. Okay, and we're going to call, this is going to be called switch text. And we're going to check is registering, and if it's registering, then we're going to say already, we'll say already have an account, log in, else, then it's going to say don't. You want to use double quotes around this since we have single quote here. So don't have an account, sign up. All right, cool. Now we want the styles, right? So I'm just gonna paste these in. So let me just grab these. Container has a couple more properties, so I'm replacing that as well. So the container, flex one, justify content, align items, header, we have the font size, input, formatted like the other inputs we have. Same thing with the button text, then we have the switch text and the error. And it's going to look like that, which I think looks pretty nice and clean. Now, if I click sign up, it brings me to this. It doesn't bring me anywhere, but it changes the state. It changes that is registering, and it shows a couple extra things or different things like the title and the button name. So already have an account, log in. Don't have an account, sign up. So now that we have the form displayed, we want to make this function, obviously. So we're going to have to bring in a couple things up top. Let's bring in use router from Expo router, and then we want to use our auth state. So whenever we want to do that, we need to bring in use auth, and that's going to be from our @context/auth context. Now from the use auth, we want to get that login and register function from the context. So we'll go right above the state here, and we can then destructure from use auth, and we want to bring in login and register. Okay, so those are the functions from our context. And just to kind of refresh your memory, if we look in auth context, this register here, which uses our auth service, and this login, which uses our auth service, those are being passed into or provided to our app and components right here. So that's how we have access to it, and we're exporting it with the use auth hook. Okay, so we're bringing it in here, and now we're going to have a function within the component to call those. So let's say handle auth, set that equal to an async function. All right, and first thing, whoops, backwards. First thing we're going to do is check for the email and password, make sure that the user typed those in. So we'll say if not email, and we'll add a .trim onto that, or if not password and trim. So if they don't add the two inputs, then let's set an error, and the error will say email and password are required. Okay, and the error will show because of this right here. Okay, it'll show there, and then let's just return if that happens. All right, if they do have the email and password, then we want to check for two things: if it's registering, and if the confirm password matches the password. Right, so if we're registering, these two should match. So let's say if, and say is registering, right, and the password, if that is not equal to the confirm password, then we want to set an error, and we'll say that the passwords do not match, and then we'll return. All right, now once that validation is done, we want to make the request to the context functions, the register and login. So I'm going to initialize a response variable here because it's going to be different depending on if is registering. So if it's registering, then we want that response to hold the response from the register function, which takes in email and password. Okay, and then I can copy that line, and then else, if it's login, then we want to call, if it's not is registering, then we want to call the login function. After that, we'll check for an error, so we'll say if response dot error. Then let's do an alert. So alert, and we'll just do error, and let's pass in the response.error. And then we'll just return. Okay, and then if there's not an error, we just want to replace the page with the notes page in the stack. So let's say router dot, and then replace, and we want to do /notes. Okay, so once they're logged in or registered and logged in, then it goes to the notes page. And did I don't think I initialized the router. No, I didn't. So let's just go right here and say const router, set that to use router. All right, now the handle auth where we want to call this is going to be obviously the button, this either the sign up or login button, which are the same button, they just have different text. So it's this right here. So let's say on press, then we just want to call handle auth. And I think that's it. So we can try this out. Let's try to register a new user. I'm just going to refresh the project. So I come to the home page, get started. I'm not logged in, so it's going to send me here. I don't have an account, so I'm going to click sign up, and I'll just do, let's say, Brad@gmail. Oh, you know what? This says automatic strong password cover view text. I think that's because of this secure text entry, but I believe we can just do text content type none, and then do the same for the confirm. So text content type none. Let's try this again. Would you like to save this password? No. All right, so I want to sign up, Brad@gmail. Okay, so now it's letting me. All right, so let's click sign up. And there we go, it takes us to the notes. Now at the moment, no matter who you log in as, you're gonna see Appwrite Note and Appwrite Note 2, because we have no checks to see who the user is and who the notes belong to. There's not even a user ID attribute or field in the database yet. So that's something that we want to do. But before we get to that, I want to be able to log out, right? Because right now there's no way to log out. So let's work on that next. And as far as where to put the log out, you have a few options. We could put it on the notes screen, but what if you have other parts or other screens where you want to be able to log out? So I think we should put it right in the header, which means we're going to add it to the main layout or the root layout. So I'm just going to close this stuff up, and let's go to app and then _layout, so your root layout. And then we're going to bring in addition to the auth provider, we're going to bring in use auth, because we need to get not only the user, but we need that logout function. And then there's a couple things from React Native. So we need touchable opacity, and we want the text component, and we want style sheet, because there is a couple styles for the button. And then what I'm going to do is create like a subcomponent for the header logout, and I'm just going to put it in this file. If you wanted to create a separate file, you could. But let's say const header header logout, and I'm going to set that to a function, and this is where I want to get the user and the logout function from the state, the global state context. So user and logout we can get with use auth. Right, and then what I want to return from this is going to be the logout button, but only if we're logged in. So I'll say if user, then we want to show the button, else then this should be null. Okay, so within the parentheses here, we'll add our touchable opacity. Okay, and we'll add on to this our style. So that's going to be styles dot, we'll say styles dot logout. and then it's going to have an on press, and that on press is going to call the logout function from our context that we just brought in. And then within the touchable opacity, we'll have a text component, and let's just add style onto that, styles dot, and then we'll say logout text, and that's just going to say logout. Okay, now if I save this, nothing's going to show because we haven't done anything with this header logout component. And I want it to go in the header on the right side. And what's cool is we can actually go into the stack, the screen options, and we can add to it. Let's see, we'll go right here, and we can just say header right and set that to a function. And whatever we return from this is what will show in the right side of the header. And we want to show the header logout. Okay, make sure you put a comma after it. And then there's just a couple styles that I want to add to the bottom here. So let me just grab those, and let's say const styles, style sheet dot create, and then paste in the logout button and the logout text. So we'll save that. Let's see, it should have a red background. Did I not add the class? Oh, I just said logout, logout button. There we go. So yeah, I mean, it's not the best looking thing, but it's a button. If you want to change the style up, you can, but I should be able to now click on it. I'm on the notes page, logged in. If I click on logout, now I get redirected because the notes page checks to see if we're logged in. That logged me out, so now it redirected me to the login page. So let's test out the login. I know we signed up for a user and it logged us in right away, but if we do this, let's say Brad@gmail, and I'm going to put the wrong password. All right, so with the wrong password, it's not showing the error, so I must have missed something. Let's go to the auth index. So we should be showing errors here. So let's see, passwords don't match. Oh, you know what? We didn't bring the alert component in. Got to make sure we bring that in. All right, so I'm going to just refresh this. And let's try it again. So Brad. And again, I'm going to put the wrong password. There we go. So invalid password, param. I mean, you could make it look better than this, but it's just returning the error that was generated. All right, so let's try the real password. Oh, enter doesn't work. There we go. So we're able to log in. This is kind of annoying, this would you like to save password. But yeah, so we can now register, we can log in, and we can log out. Now we need to tackle the notes being personalized, because right now everybody sees the same note or same notes. And another thing I want to do is, if we're logged in, I don't want to even see this welcome page. This should be just for guests. So why don't we do that first, because that's a really easy fix. So we're going to open up the home page, which is just app index.jsx, so your home screen. And we want to bring in here use auth so that we can check for the user. So we want to import that from, and that's going to be /contexts/auth context. And then we're also going to bring in the activity indicator from React Native. So activity indicator. And then let's go right above the use router initialization, and let's get the user, and let's get loading from our context using use auth. And then we're also going to need use effect. So let's say import use effect from React, and we're going to use that right above the return. So use effect, and then for the dependency array, we're going to pass in user and loading. And what we want to do in this use effect is check to see, first off, if it's not loading. So if it's done loading, and there's a user, which means we're logged in. If that's true, then let's take our router and call replace, and we want to go to the notes page. All right, and then let's go right under the use effect and show the activity indicator if it's loading. So if loading, then we're going to return a view. So return a view, and then add style, styles dot, and we're going to call this centered container. And this is where we're going to put our activity indicator. I'm going to give it a size of large. Oops. And let's give it a color of hexadecimal 007 BFF. All right, and then as far as those styles, so centered container, let's say align items to center, and we'll do justify content, center, and let's do align, text align, center. Okay. So loading doesn't exist. I spelled it wrong. Let's see. Right here. All right, so now you can see that not only did it redirect me from the welcome page, but that home, that link here that goes home, that button is gone, which is cool that it just does that automatically. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's make the notes personalized. And in order to do that, we're going to have to create a new field or a new attribute in our notes for the user ID. So we'll just close this stuff up for now. And let's see, I think this is an old error, but just want to make sure. Yeah. All right, so let's go to our Appwrite. And I'm going to go, let's see, we're going to go to our notes collection. And let's just delete the ones we have. And I'll actually just do that from the app. We should probably put something here that says like no notes. If if there's none, we'll do that after though. And if I refresh this, we should see those are gone. And now what we want to do is go to attributes and create attribute string, and we're going to call this user underscore ID. And it's for the size. I'm not sure the exact size of the IDs. I'm just going to say 100 to keep it safe, and then required, and then create. So now we have a user ID field on our notes. So now let's go back to our project, and a few things we need to update. We need to make it so when we add a new note, that ID gets put in there, the user ID, which we can get access to very easily because we have the user in our global state. And then when we show the notes, we have to filter by the user as well. So let's start off with the add note. So in the note service, right here, so this add note, I'm going to have it pass in or get passed in a user ID. All right, and then down here where we have the data object to be submitted, let's say user ID, and that's going to be set to user ID. That's passed in. Now, where we call this is in the note or the app folder notes index, and we have an add note function right here. So, and we have the user available because of this, right? We're getting it from our context from the use auth. So all we have to do is when we call that note service dot add note is just simply add user dot and then $ID, and that should add the user. So let's try that out. I'm going to come over here. Let's just refresh the project. Okay, I'm going to click add note, and let's say Brad's note, save. Okay, so it adds my note just like it did before, but if I go to the interface here, and I go to my documents, you can see under the user ID is my user ID. Okay, so we get that part done. Now we need to filter the notes. So again, we're going to go back to the note service. and we're gonna have to use a query from the React Native Appwrite library, or the SDK. So we're going to bring that in addition to ID, we're going to bring in query. And then we're going to go to getNotes. So this right here, let's close that up. So getNotes, and let's see. So first off, we want to check for the user ID. Yeah, let's do that first. So within getNotes, actually it's going to get passed in user ID like that. And then within getNotes, we're going to say if not user ID, then let's do a console.error, and we'll say error, and then, or yeah, we'll just have a string that says error, and we'll say missing user ID in getNotes. Okay, so that's the console error. Then we're going to return from this just an empty data array. Okay, because there has to be a user ID. So empty array, and then let's also just send an error and say user ID is missing. Okay, and then down here where we make what we call the list documents, we can add a query by adding a third argument here. So we have the database ID, the collection ID, and then we can have an array of queries, and this is going to be query.equal. Okay, query.equal, and we want to pass in the string of user ID. That's the attribute or the field we want to match, and we want to match it with the user ID that's passed in to the function. And you know what? Let's actually put this in a try catch. So after that first initial check, let's do a try catch, and then what I'm going to do is take this here and cut it, and then right under it we'll return the response, and then we'll get rid of this and get rid of this, and then in the catch here, so if something goes wrong, then let's do a console log and say error fetching notes, and we'll put the message, so error.message. Okay, and then what we want to return is an object with an empty data array, and then error will be error.message. I think that's a better way to do this. Okay, so we got user ID is missing, and that's because when we call this getNotes from our component, we're not passing the user ID in, and we're going to get to that. But there's another thing we need to do, because this uses the database service, right? And it's not prepared to take in this array, this query, right? Because this list documents is the one we created. That's not from the SDK. So we actually have to edit the database service list documents. So to handle that, so let's go into database service, and then where we have list documents, and we're just going to add in here a third parameter of, let's say, queries, and by default that'll just be an empty array. And then we need to use that, so let's go right where we have the database.listDocuments, which is the SDK function, and then we'll pass in the queries. And this should actually be right here where we return this response documents. It should actually be in an object, and this should be data. Yeah, so it should be data and then response.documents, or just an empty array. And then let's also pass error and just make that null. All right, so we're going to save that, and we're still going to have the user ID missing, because the last piece of the puzzle is in the index, which is our note screen, so notes index.js. where we call the note service getNotes, we simply need to pass in our user.moneySignID. And there we go. If I refresh, we shouldn't see that error anymore. And I see Brad's note. Now, if we log in as a different user, we shouldn't see Brad's note. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to log out. I'm going to sign up as someone else. Let's just say test@test.com. Okay, sign up. It's going to sign up and log us in, and I don't see the Brad's note. All right, if I add a new one, I'll say test note, save it, and I see test note. Log back out, log in as Brad. And I see Brad's note. Okay, cool. So I'm going to delete that, and then the last thing I want to do is just have it say, like, you know, no notes or whatever. So let's go, actually, yeah, we're already in our notes index file. So let's go down to the output. And then right above the note list, right here, let's just say, let's open some curly braces, and we'll say if the notes dot length, if that's equal to 0, then show something else, and this note list, we're going to cut that from here, and that's going to go in this second parentheses. In the first one, we want to have a text component, so text, and we're just going to say you have no notes. And let's just add a style to that. So that'll be styles dot, and we'll say no notes text. And then we'll just add that down here. So no notes text, and let's just align it to the center. So text align to center. Let's do the font size of 18. We'll do font weight, bold. Color, we'll do 555. And margin top, we'll do 15. There we go. You have no notes. Add another one. Let's say, okay, and I can edit it. So everything's working perfectly. So that's it as far as developing our project. Let's talk a little bit about building it out and publishing. So now that you have a working app, you can publish it to the app stores. You can use Expo's build service to build your app for iOS and Android. If you want to submit to the App Store or the Google Play Store, you do need a developer account, so I'm not going to go over that, but I'll show you how to build your app, how you can download or create and download an APK or an IPA file, and you can actually install it on your device, or you can just use it within an emulator. So what makes this really easy is something called the EAS CLI, and you can install that globally. So I'm going to stop the server here, and you can do npm install -g and then EAS-CLI, and I just need to add sudo here. All right. Once you do that, you can do EAS and then login. Now this is going to be your expo.dev account, which I would highly recommend you create. So right here, expo dev, you can just sign up. Just log in here just so you can see. And I don't think that's the right password. Okay, so and this will show you your dashboard with all your projects and just all your builds, anything to do with your React Native app. So I'm going to log in through the terminal, well, not that, through VS Code. with that same account. And it says logged in. Now what you're going to do is initialize your project. So we can do EAS and then init. So it's going to say, would you like to create a project? And I'm going to say yes. Okay, so it's going to create this project with expo.dev, successfully linked. I should see that now if I come back here. If I reload, there it is, Notes app. Okay, and it'll show me like all the project activity and all that stuff. Now, if you want to build for, let's say we want to build for Android, we could do EAS build and then Android, platform, and specify the platform as Android. Okay, and then it's going to go through this. This could take a few minutes. Once it's done, you'll get a link to download your APK file, which is your Android file. And you can actually install that on your Android device directly. And you can also submit it to the Google Play Store right from the Expo dashboard. So it's as easy as that. What would you like your Android application ID to be? I guess I'll just keep that, com.btraversy notes app. Generate a new key store. We're going to say yes for that. And then compressing project files. This gives us a link to the build details. Okay. So Android Play Store build. Basically just showing us the same thing that, is happening right now. So it's just really cool how everything is so integrated. It's miles and miles ahead of how React Native, how the workflow was back when it first came out. All right, so now this is done, and you can see the file here, the AAB file. And it's going to download here. And you can actually install your file onto your Android device, your physical device, or in the Android simulator in Android Studio. Now, I don't have Android Studio installed on this machine, so I can't show you that, but it's as easy as just dragging it over, I believe. Now, for iOS, you would do the same thing. You would run -- platform iOS, but I believe it's going to ask me for my developer ID. So I'm not going to go through that. Yeah, right here. So what would you like your well, that's not it, but if I hit enter, yes, just want to show you. So it's going to ask if I want to log in with my Apple account. I'm going to say no, and it's going to ask for my Apple developer account ID to continue. So I'm not going to do that, but it's as easy as running a command to build your file. And then from there, you can take those files, you can submit them to the App Store and go through that process, which is just beyond the scope of this tutorial. All right, so that's pretty much it, guys. You can now create mobile apps with JavaScript. You don't have to have Java or Kotlin or Swift knowledge. You can do it with JavaScript with React Native. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you followed along with the whole thing, congratulations. And it's not an easy thing to do, especially these days. People's attention spans are just shot. But I really appreciate it. If you liked the video, please leave a like. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.